Montana Territory, late spring of 1871. The wind cut sharp through the cottonwoods lining the creek, and the church bell in Dry Creek Hollow rang once, just as the sun broke over the hills. Odella Jane Harper tightened her shawl around her shoulders, her arms cradling the sleeping baby swaddled in a worn quilt. She stood alone on the wooden steps of St. Elias Church, her boots dusty from the long walk from the edge of town. Her hands trembled, but not from the cold. She looked down at the infant barely 2 weeks old, cheeks pink against the morning air, and whispered, "I am so sorry." Her voice cracked. "I tried, I really did." The church door remained closed. No one had come yet. She had no kin, no money, no one left in the world who would care. Odella placed the baby gently on the top step, tucked the edge of the quilt closer around her, and kissed her tiny forehead. She turned and stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. Her boots hit the dirt just as a voice behind her rang out. "Is that your baby?" She turned sharply. A tall man on horseback had reined in at the edge of the churchyard. His hat was pulled low, but she could see his eyes dark, steady, and watching her close. He dismounted in one swift motion, long coat flaring behind him. He stepped forward, boots crunching the gravel. Odella's heart pounded. "Do not come closer. I mean no harm." He kept his distance. "But you cannot just leave her here." "She will be safer," Odella said. Her voice was hoarse. "I have nothing, no food, no home. I have not slept more than an hour in days. I cannot do this anymore." The man looked down at the baby, then back at her. "What is her name?" "Kenna," Odella whispered. He nodded. "Mine is Xander Zane. You and Kenna are coming with me." Odella stared at him. "What?" He stepped closer, slow and careful, until he stood just beside the baby. "I have a cabin west of here near the river forks. It is not much, but it is clean. I have food, a roof. You can rest there. You can both be safe. You do not even know me." "No," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "But I saw the way you looked at her before you stepped away." That was not the look of someone giving up. That was someone breaking. Odella blinked fast, tears stinging her eyes. Xander bent down and lifted Kenna gently into his arms. "Come on," he said. "You are not leaving her, and I am not letting you walk away." Odella hesitated. The wind lifted her skirt, and the cold bit through her shawl again. She looked at the man, this stranger who had appeared like a ghost out of the morning light, and then at the child now resting in his arms. She stepped forward, slow. "Why are you doing this?" He glanced at her, his eyes softening. "Because someone once did it for me." They rode together on his horse, Odella in front, Kenna bundled between them, her tiny hand curled against her chest. Xander's arms were steady around them both, and he guided the horse with quiet ease. The trail was long, winding through the hills and into a narrow valley where cottonwoods lined the creek and wildflowers bloomed along the banks. His cabin stood tucked beneath a ridge, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside it was warm, clean. A wooden cradle stood near the hearth, like it had been waiting. "I built it last spring," Xander said as he set Kenna gently down. "Was not sure why, just had the feeling." Odella sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling. "I do not understand any of this." "You do not have to," he said. "Not today." She stared at the fire, her eyes burning. "I was married. Briefly, he left before Kenna was born. I worked in Helena, cleaning rooms, then the work dried up. I walked for 2 days to get here. I thought maybe the church, maybe someone could take her. I was so tired." Xander knelt and placed a cup of warm broth in her hand. "You are not alone anymore." She looked at him, really looked. His face was weather-worn, his jaw rough with stubble. Scars marked his knuckles. But his voice was steady, and his eyes held something she had not seen in a long time, kindness without strings. That night, Kenna slept in the cradle, her breath soft and even. Odella lay beneath warm quilts, her body aching from the long days behind her, but her chest lighter than it had been in weeks. And outside, Xander sat on the porch, watching the stars, the rifle resting across his knees. He had not planned on anyone coming into his life again. Not since the war. Not since the fire that took his brother's wife and child. But when he had seen her standing on those church steps, something inside him shifted, By morning, the snow had melted from the hills. Kenna woke with a cry, and Odella lifted her with practiced ease. Xander brought in water and the coffee boiled on the stove. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "A little," Odella said. "Thank you for the cradle," he nodded. "I am going into town today. You both stay here. I will bring back what you need." She hesitated. "You do not have to, I want to," he said, meeting her eyes, their gazes held. Something unspoken passed between them, warm and quiet. When he returned that afternoon, he brought cloth for diapers, canned peaches, a new shawl the color of cornflowers, and a small wooden rattle carved in the shape of a rabbit. Odella smiled when she saw it. "You remembered." "What?" "When we rode here, I said Kenna liked rabbits." "You noticed?" "I notice a lot more than I say." That night they sat by the fire while rain tapped the roof. Kenna slept nearby and Xander handed Odella a cup of tea. "I never expected this," she said softly. "Me neither," he said. She looked at him, her eyes full. "But I am glad you came." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. "So am I." And for the first time in a long while, Odella did not feel like she was running. She felt like she had found something steady, something real, and Xander. He knew, deep down, that the quiet ache he had lived with for years had finally started to ease. Because now there was her. And the little one. And they were not going anywhere. The first light filtered through the cabin's single window, catching on the dust motes drifting above the floorboards. Odella stood at the basin, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scrubbing out the cloth diaper with lye soap and cold water from the bucket Xander had left beside the stove. Her shoulders ached from poor sleep, but her hands moved steady. Behind her, Kenna made soft, suckling sounds in the cradle. She'd begun rooting for milk not long after dawn, and Odella had nursed her in silence, sitting on the edge of the bed, listening to the wind shift through the cottonwoods outside. Xander returned near mid-morning, a brace of grouse in one hand and a coil of wire in the other. His coat was damp at the shoulders. He kicked the mud from his boots before stepping inside. "The trapline's holding," he said, setting the birds near the hearth. "Found some fresh prints near the creek coyote or maybe a small cat." "Nothing bold." Odella wrung out the cloth and hung it on the drying line above the stove. "I heard something in the night, not close, just a cry, might have been an owl." He peeled off his gloves. "I'll set a snare near the chicken coop. They won't come near the house with the lantern burning, but we'll keep alert." She nodded, then glanced toward the cradle. "She's been fussing less." "Slept 3 hours straight last night." "That right." He crouched beside the hearth and began cleaning the birds, his knife moving with practiced ease. Odella sat down across from him, resting her hands in her lap. "You always live out here alone, since I came back from the war." He didn't pause in his work. "Started building the cabin the same spring I got off the steamer in Fort Benton. Took my time, didn't want to be near too many people." She studied his face while he worked. The way his brow furrowed in thought, not anger. "You were with the cavalry, infantry, Tennessee, marched all the way to Petersburg." He wiped the knife on a scrap of cloth. "That's a long time ago now." Odella hesitated. "Were you wounded?" He glanced up, eyes flickering to hers. "Not in a way anyone could stitch." She looked down at her hands. "I understand that." The room settled into quiet again, broken only by the crack of the fire and the occasional coo from Kenna. Outside, the wind had shifted east, carrying the scent of thawed earth and wet pine. "I'll make supper tonight," Odella said, "if you show me where you keep your cornmeal." He gave a faint nod and stood, wiping his hands. "Cupboard left of the stove, second shelf. There's dried beans in the sack beside it." She moved to the shelf, fingers brushing the burlap. "I haven't cooked in a proper kitchen since before Kenna was born. Even then, it was someone else's." Xander poured water from the kettle into the basin, testing it carefully before rinsing his hands. "This one's yours now if you want it to be." Odella turned, the sack of cornmeal in her arms. Her breath caught, but she steadied herself. "You mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean." The door rattled faintly in its frame, the wind rising again. Odella walked back to the hearth and began mixing the meal with salt and lard. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, the rhythm grounding her. Xander watched her for a moment, then turned his attention to mending a loose hinge on the cradle. He worked in silence, but the closeness between them had changed, less tentative now, like two people beginning to learn the shape of each other's presence. By early evening, the fire had burned low, and the cabin smelled of roasted grouse and cornbread. Kenna slept again, curled on her side with one fist beneath her chin. Odella and Xander sat at the table, plates scraped clean. She brushed a crumb from the corner of her mouth. "You ever think about leaving here?" "Sometimes. But then I remember what's out there." He folded his hands. "Folks with too many questions, too many ways of measuring a man by things he can't undo." Odella tilted her head. "You think I'd measure you?" He met her eyes. "No. That's why you're still here." She pressed her palm against the wooden tabletop, fingers spread. "I don't know what's ahead, but I'm willing to try, for her, and maybe for me too." Xander reached across and laid his hand over hers. The contact was warm, certain. "That's enough for today." They stayed like that a long while, hands touching, the stillness comfortable between them. When he finally rose to bank the fire, Odella stood as well and crossed to Kenna's cradle. She adjusted the quilt and brushed a strand of hair from the baby's forehead. Behind her, Xander spoke low. "I'll build a second room off the back come summer, if you want your own space." She looked over her shoulder. "I don't think I need one, not yet." He nodded once, then moved to collect the supper dishes. Outside, the wind calmed. The stars began to appear one by one over the ridge. Inside the cabin, warmth and quiet settled deep, wrapping around them like something earned. The ground thawed slow that year, and by the third week of May, the snowmelt had turned the creek into a restless ribbon of brown water. Xander hammered fence stakes along the edge of the pasture, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat catching at his nape beneath his hat. The sun was out for once, sharp and pale, but warm enough to dry the earth. Odella stood a little uphill, her skirts lifted from the mud as she coaxed Kenna to sleep against her shoulder. The baby had grown fuller in the cheeks over the last few weeks, her cry stronger, her eyes more alert. She'd taken to the cradle now without fuss, but Odella liked to keep her close when the wind quieted and the air turned soft. Xander looked up from the last post. "There's a neighbor about 3 miles south, widow named Merrill, keeps goats, trades cheese for flour." Odella shifted Kenna gently. "You think she'd be open to company?" "She's not one for idle talk, but she's fair. I thought we might take a sack of dried beans to her, see if she's got thread or sugar." "I'd like that. It's been a while since I spoke to another woman." Xander walked toward her, wiping his hands on a cloth. "She's got kin in Miles City but lives here by choice. Said she don't mind the quiet, just that it gets lonely when the roof leaks." Odella smiled faintly. "That I understand." They set out the next morning, Xander's wagon creaking along the rutted trail that wound through alder and pine. Odella rode beside him on the bench, Kenna bundled in her arms beneath a heavier blanket. The baby stayed content as the rhythm of the wheels lulled her, her small fingers twitching now and then beneath the wool. The widow Merrill lived in a sod-roofed house tucked against a rocky slope, green moss creeping over the stones. She met them at the doorway, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with hands browned from work and a face that showed neither surprise nor suspicion. "You're Zane," she said, her voice like a kettle just starting to boil. "Didn't think you'd ever bring company." Xander tipped his hat. "This is Odella Harper and her daughter, Kenna." Odella stepped forward. "We brought beans." "Xander said you might have sugar to trade." Merrill gave a single nod. "I got some. Baby looks well fed." "She's strong," Odella said. "More than I expected." Inside, the house held the scent of smoke and milk. A goat bleated from the lean-to behind the kitchen. Merrill moved with purpose, never once asking questions beyond what was necessary. She scooped sugar into a cloth sack and tied it with twine, then poured water from the kettle into 3 chipped mugs and gestured for them to sit. After a while, Merrill turned to Odella. "You plan on staying?" "I do," Odella said, her voice even. "If I'm welcome." Merrill gave a short nod. "You're not useless with a needle, are you?" No, then you'll make friends faster than I did. They left with sugar, a spool of black thread, and 2 wheels of goat cheese wrapped in cloth. On the ride home, the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of spruce and damp bark. Xander drove with one hand, the other resting lightly on the seat beside him. She doesn't waste words, Odella said. No, but she's honest. She buried her husband near the start of the war, stayed on because she said the land knew her name. Odella looked out toward the hills. I think I'd like to be known by a place again. They reached the cabin by late afternoon. Xander fed the chickens while Odella laid Kenna down, then stepped outside to gather the laundry from the line. The wind had dried the cloth stiff, and her fingers stung as she folded each piece into the basket. Xander joined her near the porch, his hands carrying the last of the feed sacks. There's a barn raising at the end of the month. The McAllens are building new. They'll need extra hands. You going, if you'd like to? Odella set the basket down. I've never been to one. It's not much. Work, food, fiddles if someone brings one. Sometimes the women bring preserves to trade. She nodded slowly. I'd like to see that. A silence settled between them again, but not empty. The kind that came when words had done enough and the day still held some light. Xander's eyes lingered on her face. You've taken to this place. I didn't expect to, but it feels like something I can grow into. He looked down, then back at her. I've watched you change since that morning, not into someone different, just more yourself. Odella felt her breath catch, but she didn't pull away. And you, Xander. Are you the same man you were before we came? No, he said quietly. Not for a long time. She stepped closer, careful, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. Then maybe we're both finding our way. He didn't answer, but his hand covered hers rough, warm, steady. And as dusk crept over the ridge, the sky deepened to a soft bruise of blue, and the first stars blinked alive above the cottonwoods. The land no longer felt like something borrowed. It felt like something beginning. The air hung close and heavy, as if summer had slipped in early while no one was watching. Odella pinned a damp sheet to the line behind the cabin, sweat beading beneath her collar despite the shade. Her dress clung at the waist, damp from scrubbing, and her hands smelled faintly of lye and sun-warmed linen. Kenna lay in the basket nearby, shaded by a bent-limbed alder. Her legs kicked at nothing, fists batting at the edge of the quilt. She'd begun to babble that week, soft gurgles and small warbles that had startled Odella more than once with their suddenness. Xander walked up from the lower pasture, a coil of rope over one shoulder, his shirt stained across one side with something dark. Not blood, engine grease. There was an axle pin near rusted through, he said. Spent half the morning under the wagon. Odella handed him a tin cup of cool water she'd drawn earlier. You need a second set of hands for things like that. I wouldn't turn it down, he said, eyeing her fingers. But you've been working yours to the bone. She didn't answer, just wiped her palms on her apron. Her eyes went to the small pile of letters wrapped in twine under the porch eave unopened, all of them, sent from a cousin in Kansas who'd once offered her a place but never followed through. She hadn't written back. Kenna's teething, she said after a moment. She doesn't cry, not much, just chews her fingers until she's raw. He crouched near the basket, watching the baby's eyes follow the dapples of sunlight through the alder leaves. She's strong. Still tracks everything like she's measuring it. Odella sat on the step, her knees aching from the morning's wash. I keep waiting for it to feel like I belong here, not just passing through. Xander leaned against one of the porch posts. You think I haven't wondered the same? She looked up at him without speaking, the quiet between them different now, heavier but not uncertain. You ever been west of the divide? He asked. No, never had reason. There's a lake there, Flathead, glacier water. So clear you can see the stones at the bottom, even when the water's deep enough to drown in. She watched the wind stir the grasses at the edge of the yard. You ever think of moving on? Used to, not anymore. He glanced toward the woods. But I think about what I'd bring if I did. Odella stood and gathered the basket, her back straight despite the weight. I don't know what I'd take. I never had much. You've got more now than you think. That evening they sat side by side on the porch after supper, Kenna sleeping in Odella's lap. The fireflies had come early, blinking in the tall grass like ash from a distant fire. A coyote called somewhere far off, clean and long. Odella shifted the baby gently, her voice low. "I don't know how to be someone's partner. I wasn't raised to expect that." Xander rested his forearm on his knee. "Neither was I. My folks, what they had was more survival than affection." She nodded, rocking slightly. "But I think I could learn. If it's quiet, if it's slow." He looked at her then, not with surprise, but with something steadier. "Then I'll match your pace." Odella exhaled, deep and long, as if something inside her had finally loosened. "I don't need promises." "No," he said, "but you'll have them anyway. When the time is right." She smiled, small and tired, and leaned her cheek against Kenna's soft crown. The baby's breath rose and fell, warm against her chest. Xander reached across the space and touched her knee just once. His hand was calloused, sure, and she didn't flinch. And when the wind shifted again, brushing warm across the porch as night settled in full, Odella didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt claimed not by a man, not by the land, but by a life that was slowly, carefully becoming hers. The morning of the barn raising broke with a sky the color of clean wool, threaded with the faintest streaks of apricot light. Odella buttoned her bodice in the small mirror nailed above the wash basin, her reflection unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Her hair was pinned higher than usual, a few soft strands left loose at Xander's gentle suggestion the night before. They'd packed the wagon early, Kenna bundled in a flour sack quilt and laid snug between 2 sacks of oats to trade. Xander had carved a wooden pull toy the week before in the shape of a dog, its tail curved like a question mark and wheels smooth to quiet. He tucked it beside the child now without comment. As they traveled the wooded path south, Odella glanced at him, his profile easy under the brim of his hat. "You always do better in a crowd than you let on," she said. "I don't do well with noise," he replied, "but I do fine with purpose." By the time they reached the McAllen place, a dozen wagons lined the fence line and voices carried with the wind. Men unrolled canvas, women lifted crockery from baskets, and children darted between piles of lumber with yelps sharp as bird calls. Odella lifted Kenna from the wagon and was greeted by the scent of beans stewing in a cast iron pot and the sound of hammer strikes echoing against the hills. She followed Xander toward the half-built frame, where he passed Kenna into her arms again before stepping into place alongside the other men. A woman in a dark blue dress approached, flour dust on her cheekbone, and a sun hat pushed back to her shoulders. "You're the one staying at Zane's," she said, not unkindly. Odella nodded. "Odella Harper, this is Kenna." The woman reached to adjust the baby's bonnet tie. "She's got the look of a watcher, like she sees through the marrow." Odella's lips parted. "You're the first to say that out loud. First doesn't mean only." She extended her hand. "I'm Nora McAllen. I'd be glad for help with the preserves if you've got a steady knife. I've got calluses enough for 2. They worked side by side, slicing apples and stirring sugar into jars while children chased each other through the grass, their laughter rising like wind through dry leaves. Odella found a quiet rhythm in the work, her sleeves rolled and her mind still. When the sun reached its peak, the men broke for food. Xander came to where Odella stood near the trestle table, his face lined with salt and dust. "You all right?" he asked, his shoulder brushing hers. She passed him a plate before answering. "I don't feel like a stranger. That's the best kind of day." They ate leaning against the wagon wheel while Kenna napped on a folded shawl, her thumb tucked beneath her chin. Xander wiped his mouth with his sleeve, then turned toward Odella. "Once the roof goes up, folks'll dance. Not for long, but long enough. You ever dance?" "Not since I was home in Tennessee. I was young and walked around like I knew something." She looked at him, her voice low. "Would you dance with me now?" He didn't answer right away, just took her hand and ran his thumb across the base of her fingers. "If you'll let me learn how again." Later, as dusk painted the fields in lavender and gold, someone drew a bow across a fiddle string and the music caught like something lit. Couples moved in slow arcs near the barn, boots scuffing the packed dirt, hems brushing the grass. Xander guided Odella close, one hand against the small of her back, the other holding hers careful but sure. She moved with him, not perfectly, but with enough grace to feel the shape of belonging. Around them, voices faded into rhythm. The music was simple, the kind that folded itself into memory without asking. "You don't talk much when you dance," she said, her breath warming his collar. "Talking ruins the listening." She rested her head against his chest, and he didn't pull away. When the tune faded, neither moved to leave the circle. They simply stood, the last notes echoing between them like a promise. That night they returned home beneath a sky pulsing with stars. Kenna slept stretched across Odella's lap, her mouth parted in a peaceful O. The flicker of a lantern in the window welcomed them. Nora had insisted they take one back, saying every new family ought to have their own. Inside the cabin, Xander set the lantern on the table and lit it. The glow spread across the walls, catching on the cradle's edge and the carved dog resting beside it. Odella laid Kenna down and turned to him. "I never asked what you wanted, Xander, not from this, from us." He moved toward her slowly as if each step meant something. "I want a life with you." That's all, no fine words, just the days ahead. She reached up, touched the side of his face, the rough edge of beard, the warmth of skin. "Then I want that too." He leaned in, kissed her with the steadiness of a man who'd waited long enough to be sure. There was no hurry in it, no unfinished need, just the quiet power of something true. The next morning they walked the pasture together, Kenna resting in Odella's sling, her tiny hand curled around her mother's braid. The creek had calmed, the banks green and thick. Xander stopped by the fence he'd built earlier that spring and turned to her. "I want to marry you before the leaves turn." Odella looked at him, the sun rising behind him, and nodded once. "We'll do it by the creek." "Just you, me, and her." He smiled, and the years ahead opened up between them, quiet, sturdy, full of work and warmth. They married in late September beneath the turning cottonwoods. Merrill stood as witness. Nora brought a pie and a length of lace for Odella's hair. Xander carved a ring from juniper and tied it to a ribbon Kenna had once tugged loose from a gift sack. They built the second room before the snow fell, and Odella stitched curtains from old flour bags, embroidering tiny shapes along the hem, stars, birds, a dog on wheels. As the seasons passed, Kenna learned to walk where wildflowers bloomed, her laughter rising like the creek in spring. Odella taught her names of plants, of birds, of the quiet things that mattered. Xander showed her how to set a snare, how to patch a fence, how to listen before speaking. At night, the three of them sat beneath the porch eaves, watching the skies slow turning. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but always they stayed close. And when the long winters came, when the wind howled at the door and the snow buried the fence posts, they stayed warm. Because they belonged to the land, to each other, and to the life they built with their own hands.